June 1945, southern Okinawa. The rain has just stopped, but the air is still thick with smoke and decay. From the mouth of a limestone cave, shapes begin to move. They are Japanese soldiers, or what is left of them. Their uniforms hang in rags, some are barefoot. One man's right arm is bound to his chest with a strip of torn blanket, the cloth dark and stiff with old blood. For days they have hidden in the cave, listening to the thunder of American artillery roll past, waiting for the final assault that never came. Now hunger has done what shells could not. They step out slowly, blinking in the sharp gray light. A scrap of white cloth tied to a broken rifle trembles in the breeze. Every story they were ever told says this is the moment of their death. The Americans, they had been warned, do not take prisoners. Surrender means torture, mutilation, certain execution. Across a churned field scattered with burned trees, khaki figures appear. American infantry, rifles at the ready, a flare of tension, then something unexpected. A canteen is tossed forward. A medic runs up, kneels, and starts to bandage the shattered arm. Within an hour, the men who had expected to die are lying behind barbed wire, eating from metal mess tins, swallowing American medicine with American water. In the months and years to come, many of them will say the same thing. This was the moment they realized almost everything they had been told about surrender and about the enemy was wrong. Before that realization could happen, a very different story had to be written into their minds. At the turn of the 20th century, Japan's leaders set out to build not just a modern army, but a modern faith in obedience. In 1882, the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors was issued in the name of the Meiji Emperor. It did not mention bushido by name, but its spirit matched the idealized warrior code that Japanese ideologues were busy resurrecting and reshaping. Absolute loyalty to the emperor, unquestioning obedience to superiors, endurance of hardship without complaint. It said nothing directly about surrender. But in army classrooms and parade grounds, officers and instructors filled that silence. To fall into enemy hands, they warned, was the deepest shame. A soldier's body belonged to the emperor. Losing it through capture was not an accident, it was a betrayal. In earlier centuries, samurai had sometimes surrendered, negotiated, even changed masters. The new military ethic allowed no such shades of gray. The modern conscript army, drawn from peasants, fishermen, shopkeepers, was taught a stark equation: better a heroic death than the living stain of captivity. Through the early 20th century, Japan fought and won. Against China in 1894–95. Against the Russian Empire in 1904–05. In these conflicts, some prisoners were taken on both sides, but harshness was common, and the idea grew that a real warrior did not allow himself to be captured alive. International law tried to catch up with the brutality of industrial war. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 set out some basic rules about prisoners. In 1929, the major Western powers agreed to a new Geneva Convention specifically on the treatment of POWs. Japan signed that convention, but it never ratified it. Within the Japanese army, that failure was not an oversight. Many officers regarded the Geneva rules as dangerous softness. They worried that if soldiers believed they could surrender and still be treated decently, their will to fight would weaken. In 1937, when war in China escalated into full-scale invasion, the prevailing attitude within the ranks was already clear. Chinese troops who laid down their arms were frequently executed. Captivity was seen less as a legal status, more as a temporary inconvenience on the way to the grave. As the 1930s wore on, the military's hold on Japanese society tightened. Schoolchildren recited patriotic verses, newspapers praised self-sacrifice. In barracks across the empire, recruits heard the same message spoken loudly, repeated often, drilled into bone. Do not expect mercy. Do not bring shame on your unit or your family. If defeat is certain, die attacking. By 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and struck British and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia, this ethic was embedded. The Imperial Army swept through Malaya and Singapore. In the Philippines, tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops surrendered on the Bataan Peninsula. To Japanese eyes, this mass capitulation confirmed what they had been taught. Western soldiers were weak. They clung to life. They surrendered to avoid hardship. The contrast dug a deeper trench in the Japanese mind. The enemy surrenders, we do not. Within each regiment and division, the consequences of breaking that rule were spelled out. If a soldier was captured, his name might be struck from the roll. His family might be told he had died in battle but with an undercurrent of disgrace. In some units there were explicit instructions, do not be taken alive, in others the expectation was simply understood. By the time Japanese forces were driven from Guadalcanal, beaten back in New Guinea, and encircled on island after island across the Central Pacific, no surrender was more than a slogan. It was a shield against fear and a trap. Men who might have laid down their arms to save their lives stayed in foxholes and caves, clinging to an image of honor that allowed no escape. All of this formed one side of a vast moral divide. On the other sat the armies that now faced Japan, the United States, Britain, Australia, shaped by their own codes, their own laws, and their own expectations about what captivity should mean. Understanding that other side is essential to grasp why the scene on Okinawa could be so shocking to the men who lived it. On the other side of the ocean, the laws of war had taken a different path. During the First World War, millions of Europeans had fallen into enemy hands. The chaos, hunger, and abuse that followed pushed diplomats to refine the rules. In 1929, the major Western powers agreed to a new Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States and Great Britain signed and ratified it. Their officers were trained with its articles in mind. The convention was clear on a few essential points. Prisoners had to be protected from violence, intimidation, and public curiosity. They had to be given food, clothing, and shelter on a level roughly comparable to that of the captor's own troops behind the lines. Wounded and sick POWs were to receive medical attention. Their names were to be registered and passed on through neutral channels so that families could be informed. The International Committee of the Red Cross would be allowed to visit camps and send parcels. In the interwar years, these ideas were turned into instructions and manuals. In 1940, the U.S. Army's Rules of Land Warfare summarized Hague and Geneva obligations. Staff officers drew up contingency plans for POW camps before the United States had even entered the Second World War. They sketched out where camps could be built, how many guards would be needed, how rations would be allocated. When American forces began to fight Germans and Italians in North Africa in 1942, those plans became reality. Captured Axis soldiers were searched, disarmed, and marched to collection points. From there, many were shipped to large camps in the United States, fenced compounds with barracks, latrines, kitchens, and infirmaries. Conditions were not luxurious. Food could be monotonous, discipline strict, but there was a framework. Prisoners received 3 meals a day. They were seen by doctors. They were allowed to write letters. Red Cross delegates took notes and filed reports. In Europe, the system was uneven but recognizable. Western POWs held by Germany usually received Red Cross parcels and had some protection from the worst abuses. Soviet POWs did not. Their death rates were catastrophic. Yet even in that brutal theater, the idea that a prisoner ought to be fed and registered rather than casually killed had some legal anchor. Across the Pacific, the contrast could hardly have been sharper. Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, but without ratification it was not legally bound in the same way. More importantly, its senior officers viewed such constraints as a threat to discipline. Many believed that treating enemy prisoners too gently would sap their own soldiers' resolve. The attitude that surrender itself was shameful bled into the treatment of those who surrendered. In April 1942, after months of fighting on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, some 76,000 American and Filipino troops laid down their arms. Starving, exhausted, racked by malaria and dysentery, they expected some kind of organized processing. Instead, they were forced into what would become known as the Bataan Death March. For roughly a week, they were driven north along dusty roads under a burning sun. Men were beaten with rifle butts if they fell behind. Those who collapsed were often left where they dropped or bayoneted or shot. Thousands died along the way from heat, disease, and violence. At the camps where the survivors arrived, food was scarce, water foul, medical supplies almost non-existent. This pattern appeared again and again. In Burma and Thailand, tens of thousands of Allied POWs and Asian laborers were worked to the edge of death on the Burma-Thailand Railway. They hacked through jungle, blasted rock, and laid track in heat and monsoon rain. Malaria, cholera, beriberi, and dysentery killed thousands. The death rate among Allied POWs under Japanese control is estimated at around 27%. Among those held by Germany and Italy, it was roughly 4%. The figures for Japanese prisoners held by the United States were very different. Once they reached established camps, death rates generally stayed in the low single digits, often below 2%, and many of those deaths were from wounds sustained before capture. On the battlefield, the situation was more complicated. From the first clashes on Guadalcanal and in New Guinea, American troops learned that Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. They saw comrades killed by wounded enemies who feigned death. They watched soldiers charge in apparent surrender, then detonate grenades at close range. The response was often brutal. In many units, an unofficial pattern took hold. Men with raised hands were met with suspicion, even gunfire. War crimes were committed. Hatred, racial prejudice, and shock at Japanese atrocities against Allied POWs on Bataan and elsewhere hardened attitudes. Yet behind the front line, the institutional policy remained anchored in Geneva. When Japanese soldiers were captured alive, dragged from foxholes, pulled unconscious from wrecked landing craft, or found wounded and unable to move, they entered a system designed to process them as prisoners of war. They were given serial numbers. Their details were recorded. They were entitled on paper to food, medical care, and protection. The first Japanese POWs in American hands were strikingly few. On Guadalcanal in late 1942, for example, thousands of Japanese died, but only a handful were captured. Many were gravely wounded. Some had tried to kill themselves rather than submit. Medics who treated them later recalled how stunned these men seemed to find themselves alive, their bandages changed by the enemy. For American planners, every prisoner was more than just a body to be fed. He was also a potential source of intelligence. Specialized interrogation centers were established in places like Honolulu and Brisbane. Japanese-speaking officers and Nisei linguists, second-generation Japanese Americans, were trained to question prisoners, extract details about unit identities, supply routes, code names, and morale. A living POW could tell you how many guns were on an island, how often convoys arrived, whether troops were running out of fuel. Keeping prisoners alive was not only a legal and moral obligation, it was tactically useful. By 1944, two systems of captivity stood facing each other across the Pacific. In one, Allied POWs struggled to survive on thin rice gruel and forced labor, many never making it home. In the other, Japanese prisoners experienced an ordered if confined existence, barbed wire, certainly, but also regular meals, access to doctors, and some measure of routine. For the ordinary Japanese infantryman crouched in a cave or foxhole, this difference was invisible. He had been told that Americans tortured prisoners, that captives were mutilated, that surrender meant the worst possible death. He knew, or thought he knew, what his own army did to those it captured. It seemed natural to assume the enemy behaved the same way. It is only when we step closer to the individuals inside this machinery, to their beliefs, their fears, their leaders, and the practical realities of camps and battlefields, that the full shape of this contradiction comes into view. To understand what surrender truly meant to a Japanese soldier in 1944 or 1945, and why news of daily food and medicine in American hands could be so shattering, we need to look at these different angles one by one. For the men inside this system, the first and deepest layer was not legal, it was emotional. A Japanese conscript in 1943 did not enter the army as a blank slate. He carried with him the weight of village expectations, family honor, the stories of heroes who had died rather than be taken. In January 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, the War Ministry issued the Field Service Code, the Senjinkan. It warned soldiers against becoming prisoners. Do not live to experience the shame of being taken prisoner, it declared. Officers explained what those words meant in practice. If a man was captured, his name might never be spoken in his home again. Families received terse notifications that their sons had died honorably in battle. Often there was no hint that they had actually survived in enemy hands. After the war, some returning POWs discovered that neighbors had already visited the family altar, bowed before their portrait, mourned them as dead. The shame could be suffocating. Many former prisoners avoided talking about their captivity for decades. Some concealed it from their own children. To admit you had surrendered was to admit you had stepped outside the ideal of the loyal subject willing to die for the emperor. The wound was not just personal. It cut across an entire society that had been told, again and again, that death was better than capture. In the cave mouths and bunkers of the Central Pacific, that shame stood between many men and the simple act of laying down a rifle. On the American side, those same men represented something else entirely. To an infantry platoon on a ridge on Guadalcanal or Bougainville, a Japanese soldier emerging with hands raised might look like a threat, a trick, a grenade waiting to explode. But to the intelligence officers waiting further back, he was a source, a chance to see into the enemy's order of battle. By 1943, the U.S. Army and Navy had created specialized organizations to exploit this opportunity. In the Southwest Pacific, the Allied translator and interpreter section sifted documents and conducted interrogations. In Hawaii and elsewhere, military intelligence service linguists, many of them Japanese Americans who had volunteered while their own families were confined in internment camps, questioned prisoners in their own language. The process could be simple. An interrogator would ask the man's name, unit, hometown. Then come the next layer of questions: how many guns in your regiment? When did you last receive supplies? How many aircraft are on that airfield? Sometimes the answers were fragmentary, clouded by fear or confusion. At other times, a single offhand remark about a shortage of artillery shells or the arrival of a new division would help build a mosaic. The value of a living prisoner rippled outward. Information from one interrogation might be cross-checked with captured maps or orders seized from a dead officer. Over time, patterns emerged. Commanders could estimate how long a garrison could fight before running out of food. Naval planners could guess when reinforcements might appear. Feeding and treating prisoners then was not just a matter of conscience. It was an investment. A man racked by untreated wounds or fever was a poor witness. A prisoner who understood that cooperation might mean a better work assignment or access to cigarettes and slightly larger rations was more likely to talk. Behind these tactical calculations, there were rules, words on paper that were meant to bind the hands of men in uniform. The American officer corps had been schooled, at least in theory, in the obligations of the Hague and Geneva Conventions. The 1929 Geneva Convention on POWs, with its clauses on humane treatment, food, shelter, and medical care, had been ratified by the U.S. Senate. Army manuals distilled it into orders. Prisoners were to be protected, registered, and housed, their wounds treated, their complaints, at least on paper, recorded. This did not prevent abuses. In the chaos of jungle fighting and the fury that followed news of atrocities like the Bataan Death March, some American units killed prisoners or refused quarter to surrendering men. Such acts were often overlooked, sometimes quietly condoned, but they were recognized, at least formally, as breaches of policy, something to be hidden, not written into doctrine. In Tokyo, the governing text looked very different. Japan was still bound by the older Hague Conventions it had accepted, and its diplomats sometimes assured the world it would apply the spirit of Geneva. But inside the army, the Field Service Code and subsequent directives made the priority clear: maintain fighting spirit at all costs. Surrender was not treated as a legal status with defined protections. It was framed as a moral collapse. Orders circulated that officers should not allow themselves to be captured. Some regulations stipulated that those who fell into enemy hands were to be regarded as having disgraced the imperial army. Lists of the missing were often pruned of prisoners' names. The effect was to erase them from the institutional memory of their own side. This divergence in written codes translated into statistics. Allied POWs in Japanese custody died in staggering numbers, often from deliberate neglect, starvation, untreated disease, brutal labor. Japanese POWs in American hands, while they sometimes suffered harshness and overcrowding, generally received rations only slightly below those of U.S. troops and had access to surgeons, nurses, and medicines that were scarce or non-existent on the front. To sustain such a gap required more than words. It demanded a material structure: camps, supply lines, doctors, guards, interrogators, forms. It required ships and trains to move thousands of captured men from beaches and jungles into fenced compounds where daily routines could be enforced. To turn legal clauses and pragmatic intelligence needs into the lived reality of daily food and medicine for enemy soldiers, an entire shadow infrastructure had to be built behind the lines. That shadow infrastructure began with wire and timber, but it relied just as much on paper and medicine. On captured islands like Guadalcanal and Bougainville, engineers and quartermasters walked ground that had only recently been fought over and measured it not in fields of fire, but in acreage for compounds. They plotted rectangles for barbed wire enclosures, marked outlines for latrines, cookhouses, water points. In places like Oahu and the mainland United States, existing training camps and fairgrounds were ringed with fencing and watchtowers, turned into long-term POW facilities. The layout was functional: double fences of barbed wire, guard towers at the corners, sometimes with searchlights, rows of wooden barracks or canvas tents depending on climate and urgency, a small hospital block or at least an infirmary hut, often staffed by medical personnel who had been treating American wounded only weeks before. Into this grid flowed men from dozens of battlefields. On the docks of Honolulu or San Francisco, Japanese prisoners stepped off transport ships under guard, wearing faded uniforms, sometimes still bandaged from wounds received far away. They were marched to waiting trucks and driven to camps whose routines were already established: morning roll call, work details, evening head counts. Their names or approximations of them were entered on cards, fingerprints were taken, each man was assigned a number. Food was the daily anchor. American logistics in the Second World War operated on a scale the Japanese could scarcely imagine. Vast convoys carried flour, canned meat, powdered milk, vegetables, and medical supplies across the Pacific. U.S. troops at the front cursed the monotony of sea rations and powdered eggs, but the calories were there. Prison menus reflected this abundance, if in reduced form. Rice was often provided to Japanese POWs when supplies allowed, both for practicality and as a concession to habit. When rice ran short, there was bread, potatoes, beans. Meat, usually canned, turned up several times a week. The exact level of ration varied by theater and by the fortunes of war, but the underlying principle remained. Prisoners had to be kept alive and capable of work. Medicine was a different kind of ration. By the mid-war years, American doctors carried sulfonamide drugs, plasma, and techniques for transfusion and surgery that dramatically improved survival rates. These were applied, at least in organized camps, without regard to the flag a man had once fought under. Appendectomies, amputations, skin grafts, the procedures that saved wounded American soldiers were also used on captured Japanese. In some camps, vaccination programs were extended to POWs to prevent typhoid or other epidemics that might spread to guards. Dental care, rudimentary but real, sometimes reached men who had never seen a dentist in their life. The image of a Japanese prisoner lying on a gurney while an American surgeon leaned over him with a scalpel or syringe would have been inconceivable to many of his comrades still in the field. Yet this physical apparatus, the fences, the bunks, the meals, the wards, was only one front in a quieter war. Deep in the planning offices of Pacific headquarters, officers saw in these realities an opportunity to erode the enemy's will from within. American psychological warfare units, small but growing, studied Japanese culture, language, and battlefield behavior. They understood that most Japanese soldiers did not believe they could be captured and live. To break that conviction, they needed more than words. They needed images. From early 1944 onward, U.S. forces began to collect photographs and film of Japanese POWs eating, working, even laughing in camps. Scenes of men sitting on benches with bowls of rice or lining up at a dispensary window to receive medicine were not just archived, they were turned into leaflets and visual proofs. On Saipan, Guam, the Philippines, and later Okinawa, aircraft dropped millions of leaflets behind Japanese lines. Some bore messages in careful Japanese script, promises that those who surrendered would receive humane treatment, food, medical care. Others showed pictures, rows of captured soldiers apparently unharmed, smoking, receiving bandages. Along the front, specially equipped teams used loudspeakers to broadcast messages into ravines and caves. Japanese-American linguists, voices echoing across shattered ridges, called out that the war was turning, that surrender did not mean certain death. They sometimes named specific units known to be trapped, appealed to soldiers by hometown or prefecture. They spoke of daily meals, of medicine, of letters home. Reactions varied. Many Japanese soldiers, steeped in years of propaganda and fearful of the ridicule of their comrades, dismissed the leaflets as lies. Some collected them only to turn them in as proof of loyalty. Others read them in secret and hid them in their tunics, the pictures lingering in their minds as rations dwindled and disease spread. Rumors traveled in their own channels. A man who had seen a comrade captured and not immediately killed might whisper about it in a dugout. Another who had intercepted a leaflet showing prisoners in clean clothes might share it in a bunker. In the claustrophobic darkness of caves in the Central Pacific, reality and rumor mixed, slowly chipping at the certainty that the only choices were victory or death. At the highest levels, these efforts were shaped and constrained by leaders who carried their own ideas of honor, law, and strategy. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt and his senior advisors understood that adherence to the Geneva Conventions was not merely a point of morality. It was also a diplomatic weapon. The United States could criticize Axis atrocities more forcefully if it could point to its own record of compliance. The War Department issued directives reminding commanders that POWs were to be treated according to international law. Violations, when documented, were officially condemned, even if not always punished with equal vigor. In the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz both recognized the dual value of prisoners, as intelligence assets and as symbols in a broader battle for perception. Their headquarters circulated instructions on the handling of POWs, sometimes including practical guidelines on processing, sometimes broader reminders that the eyes of the world were watching. In Tokyo, the center of gravity lay elsewhere. Prime Minister Heike Tojo, himself an army general, embodied the fusion of militarism and government. The War Ministry, guided by officers steeped in pro-war doctrines, issued circulars that reinforced the themes of the Field Service Code: unbending loyalty, death before capture. On outlying fronts, commanders received orders couched in phrases like "Jyokusei, honorable death like a shattered jewel," urging units to fight to extinction rather than surrender. By the last year of the war, this stance had become both a creed and a sentence. On islands like Biak, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, Japanese garrisons fought from tunnels and bunkers until almost none were left, sporadic surrenders counting more as anomalies than trends. Those few who did fall into American hands alive entered the camp system, and their existence was sometimes exploited in propaganda broadcasts. But for the majority still under arms, the myth of the merciless enemy and the duty of self-destruction held sway. That myth was about to meet a harder reality. In the summer of 1944, on the volcanic slopes and coastline of Saipan, the Imperial Army and Navy would stage one of their fiercest defenses. They would also, under the crushing weight of defeat, begin to yield prisoners in numbers not yet seen in the Pacific War. There, and on Okinawa the following year, the gap between what Japanese soldiers believed about surrender and what they actually experienced in American hands would open like a fault line. In that gap lay not only their survival but a profound shock that would haunt them long after the barbed wire came down. June 1944, the sea off Saipan glows with the flashes of naval gunfire. For 3 days before the landings, American battleships and cruisers pour shells into the island. Palms are stripped bare, hills crumble, fuel dumps burn in columns of black smoke. Offshore, a forest of masts and hulls crowds the horizon, the largest amphibious armada yet seen in the Pacific. Saipan is not just another speck of coral, it is the gateway to the Marianas. From its airfields, American B-29 bombers will be able to reach the Japanese home islands. For Tokyo, its loss would be a strategic disaster. For the garrison, it is a sentence. On 15 June, the first waves of U.S. Marines push toward the beaches under punishing fire. Japanese coastal guns, mortars, and machine guns rake the landing craft. Men tumble into the surf. Some drown under the weight of equipment. Others crawl through the sand, hugging the brief shelter of shell craters as they fight inland. The defenders have prepared for this moment. Roughly 30,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo occupy Saipan. They have honeycombed the island with caves, pillboxes, and concealed artillery. Their orders are simple and absolute: hold the island, inflict maximum casualties, die rather than surrender. Behind the front line, about 25,000 Japanese civilians, settlers from the home islands, Okinawans, and native Chamorro and Carolinian Islanders watch and wait. For years they have heard warnings that Americans are brutal, that women will be raped, that children will be killed. Pamphlets, school lessons, and speeches have all carried the same message: better to die as a subject of the emperor than live as the enemy's captive. The battle that follows is grinding and intimate. Marines and later soldiers of the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division fight yard by yard across cane fields, along ridges, through villages. Japanese troops counterattack at night, infiltrate through the lines, fire from concealed positions at point-blank range. American casualties climb, so do Japanese. From the first days, a pattern appears. Again and again, American patrols find positions where every defender has died in place. Grenades clutched to the chest, final bullets reserved for themselves. In some caves, the bodies are piled near the entrance, riddled by artillery. In others, men have taken their own lives as American flamethrowers and demolition charges closed in. Yet not everyone chooses death. Wounded men, unable to move, are captured where they lie. Others, driven by thirst and hunger, are cut off from their units and stumble into American lines with hands raised, half expecting to be shot on sight. A few are pulled senseless from rubble, only to wake on stretchers under strange canvas roofs. By late June, as organized Japanese resistance begins to contract toward the northern end of the island, American officers notice something they have rarely seen in this theater. The number of living prisoners is slowly, almost imperceptibly, growing. The atmosphere among the defenders tightens. General Saito, himself ill and exhausted, issues orders reminding his men of their duty. Messages from higher command emphasize Jyokusei, honorable death. Every rumor of a surrender is a stain. Officers distribute grenades not just to soldiers but to civilians hiding in caves. Instructions are whispered: when the Americans come, do not be taken. On 7 July 1944, the doctrine of death over capture is enacted in a single terrible gesture. In the pre-dawn darkness, the remnants of several Japanese units, including walking wounded, laborers, even hospital patients, mass on the slopes near Tanapag Plain. Perhaps 3,000 men, many armed only with rifles, bayonets lashed to sticks, or even bamboo spears, form up. At first light, they surge forward in one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War. They crash into positions held by the 27th Infantry Division. Forward companies are overrun. Machine gun crews are killed at their guns. Medics are cut down as they try to help the wounded. Some Japanese soldiers run through American lines and attack rear areas, slashing tents, bayoneting anyone they encounter. By the time the assault is broken under concentrated fire and artillery, almost all of the attackers are dead. In his final messages, Sato declares that the garrison will fight to the last man. Shortly afterward, with the battle clearly lost, he and Admiral Nagumo commit suicide. Officially, the island is to die with them. Reality refuses to obey. As American units push north toward the cliffs at the island's tip, they encounter a scene that will sear itself into memory. On the jagged heights above the sea, near what would later be called Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, clusters of civilians gather. Japanese military police and soldiers shout instructions. Some fire warning shots. Mothers clutch children. Grenades are passed hand to hand. From below, American observers watch in horror as men, women, and children walk or run to the brink and leap into the waves or onto rocks far below. Others huddle around explosives and vanish in blasts of dust and smoke. The stories they have been told of American torture, of brutal captivity, are carrying them to their deaths. Yet even here, the pattern is not uniform. Between the mass suicides, other families hesitate. Some wave white cloths and creep down goat paths. Others are coaxed by Japanese-speaking interpreters calling through loudhailers, offering safety, food, and medical care. Marines and soldiers risk their lives to climb up and try to stop the jumps, catching those they can, watching many more slip away. By the time organized resistance ends around 9 July, Saipan has become both a symbol of ultimate sacrifice and something more complicated. Out of roughly 30,000 Japanese troops and sailors, only a few hundred have been taken prisoner. But thousands of civilians, estimates range around 10,000, have fallen into American hands alive. They line up for rations. They sit in improvised camps under guard, stunned, grieving, but breathing. Photographers and cameramen are there. American combat camera units film Japanese prisoners receiving bowls of rice and canned meat, queuing at medical tents, having wounds dressed by Navy corpsmen and Army medics. Still photographs capture moments of dissonance. A captured officer with his arm in a sling being handed a cigarette. Children being weighed and examined by doctors in white coats, women cooking under makeshift tarps within newly strung perimeters of wire. To U.S. audiences back home, these images will later be shown as proof of American decency, contrasting sharply with reports of Bitan, of the Burma Railway, of massacres in China and the Philippines. To American psychological warfare units, they are raw material. Leaflets prepared in the months after Saipan feature photographs taken there. Text in careful Japanese reassures readers that those who lay down their arms will receive food, shelter, and medical care. The pictures show men in Japanese uniforms sitting in the shade eating, not being tortured. They show sick civilians being tended by enemy doctors. For the Japanese prisoners themselves, the shock is more immediate, more intimate. Many arrive in camps expecting blows or worse. Instead, they are searched, registered, and issued basic clothing. They are given food often more and more regularly than they had seen during the final weeks of the battle. Medics clean their wounds. Some are evacuated to hospital ships lying offshore where they find themselves under crisp white sheets beneath electric lights, hearing the clink of instruments and the low murmur of American nurses. Later testimonies from survivors of Saipan echo a similar theme. They had been taught that the enemy would mutilate their bodies. Instead, the enemy stitched their wounds. They had been told they would be starved and beaten. Instead, they found mess lines and metal trays of food. They had been sure their families would never know their fate. Instead, in some cases, their names and status as POWs were recorded and transmitted through neutral channels. On Saipan, the numbers of Japanese prisoners were still small compared to the scale of the garrison. The ideology of no surrender remained largely intact. The cliffs and the Banzai Charge stood in many minds as the true expression of the Imperial Army's spirit. But the cracks were there. Officers in Tokyo received reports, fragmentary, reluctant but real, that civilians had survived under American control. Interrogation summaries reached American headquarters full of details provided by living prisoners. And among the hundreds of men behind barbed wire, a new and unsettling knowledge took root. The Americans did not always behave as they had been described. This realization would deepen and spread in the last year of the war as the fighting came closer to the Japanese homeland itself. On a larger island with an even greater civilian population and a garrison ordered to resist to the end, the doctrine of death over surrender would be tested more severely, and more Japanese soldiers would discover firsthand what captivity in American hands actually meant. April 1945, off the shores of Okinawa, the ocean hums with ships. More than 1,400 vessels, battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports crowd the waters. It is the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. On land, the island stretches long and narrow, its ridges and low hills covered in fields, villages, and limestone outcrops riddled with caves. For Japan, Okinawa is the outer wall of the homeland. For the United States, it is the last stepping stone before a possible invasion of Kyushu and Honshu. On its soil, those two visions collide. The Japanese 32nd Army, under General Mitsuru Ushijima and his fiery chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, has entrenched roughly 100,000 troops on the island. They have learned from earlier defeats. Instead of meeting the Americans on the beaches, they fall back to a prepared belt of fortifications anchored on the Shuri Line in the south, caves, tunnels, reverse slope positions designed to blunt and bleed an attacker. Around them live as many as 300,000 Okinawan civilians caught between two empires. For years, Japanese authorities have told them grim tales of the Americans, atrocities, rape, mutilation. Leaflets and speeches urge them to die as loyal subjects if the enemy comes. On 1 April 1945, Easter Sunday, American troops wade ashore with almost eerie ease. The beaches are nearly empty of defenders. Marines of the 1st and 6th Divisions and soldiers of the 7th and 96th Divisions push inland against light resistance, seizing airfields and high ground. For a moment, some wonder if the Japanese have finally lost their will to fight. Then they hit the Shuri positions. Rain and mud turn fields into sucking bogs. Mortars and artillery from hidden emplacements crash down with deadly accuracy. Each ridge conceals interlocking bunkers and cave mouths. When one position falls, fire erupts from another angle. Weeks stretch into months. Flamethrowers and satchel charges become as vital as rifles. In this nightmare landscape, surrender seems even less likely than before. American soldiers and Marines move through terrain where bodies and booby traps lie side by side. Stories spread of wounded Japanese feigning submission, then exploding grenades. Many units adopt an attitude of harsh suspicion. A man advancing with hands raised can look like a walking bomb. Japanese troops receive no encouragement from their own commanders. Orders from Ushijima's headquarters emphasize resolute defense, and if necessary, Jyokusai, honorable death. Field service code phrases echo down tunnels and trenches. Military police watch for hesitation. Civilians are told that capture means violation and torture, that Americans will kill them or force them into slavery. On nearby Kuramaredo in the opening days of the campaign, small groups of islanders already have killed themselves under the sway of such beliefs. Yet as April turns into May, the machinery of war begins to grind the 32nd Army down. American artillery and naval gunfire collapse cave roofs and tunnel mouths. Airstrikes pin down any move in daylight. Supply lines constrict. Rice runs short. Ammunition dwindles. Units are cut off and reduced to scattered pockets. Communications break. By late May, the Shuri Line is cracking. In this chaos, the absolute certainties that kept many men fighting erode at the edges. Wounded soldiers, unable to move with their units, are left in shell holes and shattered bunkers. Some are discovered by American patrols and taken in, more by reflex than design. Others, hearing rumors that a few captives have not been killed, start to weigh a choice they have never truly considered. On the American side, psychological warfare units step up their efforts. Loudspeaker teams crawl forward under cover, their equipment mounted on jeeps or sheltered behind embankments. Japanese-American linguists call out over the din of battle, their voices amplified across ravines and hillsides, appeals to isolated soldiers to surrender, assurances of food, cigarettes, medical treatment. Leaflets stamped with images from Saipan and other islands flutter down from artillery shells and aircraft. They show Japanese prisoners in camps, eating, receiving medical care, writing letters. The text promises that those who lay down arms will be treated according to international law. Some soldiers burn these slips immediately, cursing. Others shove them into pockets, eyes flicking to the faded photos when no one is watching. The ground combat nears its bloody conclusion in June. American forces drive the remnants of organized Japanese resistance southward toward the rugged ground around Mabuni. Civilians, prodded by propaganda and threatened by some military personnel, flee with them into the hills and caves. Under artillery fire and Ustruck, the last strongpoints collapse. On 21 June, General Ushijima and General Cha commit suicide on a slope overlooking the sea. In practical terms, the battle is over. But scattered groups of soldiers and armed civilians remain in the south and in isolated northern pockets cut off from orders. Here, the Lung Nutyoad myth of the merciless enemy finally confronts the immediate reality of survival. On slopes overlooking newly established American positions, gaunt men peer down at camps and bivouacs. Through field glasses or naked eyes, they see something that does not fit the stories they were told. Lines of prisoners, some in their own tattered uniforms, stand in orderly queues. They receive bowls of food. They walk back behind barbed wire, not to execution pits but to tents. On back roads and in gullies, small groups begin to take a chance. A ragged band steps from a grove of sugarcane, hands raised, weapons discarded. They move slowly, expecting at any moment a burst of machine gun fire. Instead, they are shouted at, searched, ordered to sit. Canteens are passed. Cigarettes are tossed from a distance. A medic checks bandages and wounds, his hands methodical, impersonal. Elsewhere, a wounded man crawls toward American lines under a makeshift white flag. He has tied his undershirt to a stick. On reaching an outpost, he collapses. When he wakes, it is under canvas, hearing the rattle of enamel cups and the murmur of English. An IV bottle hangs beside his stretcher. His pulse is being taken. By the final weeks of combat and mopping up operations, these individual acts add up. On Okinawa, roughly 7,000 Japanese soldiers are eventually taken prisoner. A small fraction of the original garrison, but a far higher number than on Iwo Jima or earlier island battles. Tens of thousands of civilians also come under American control. They fill hastily built refugee compounds, fenced camps with tents, latrines, water tanks, and medical posts. For those soldiers now behind wire, life takes on a strange, numbing rhythm. They are moved from initial collection points near the front to larger camps in the island's center and north. Registration teams record names, ranks, humtuns. Each man receives a number. Guards explain, often through interpreters, the rules, where they may walk, when they must assemble, what labor they will perform. Food arrives on a schedule. In the morning there is usually rice or a substitute starch, sometimes bread, sometimes potatoes, and a watery soup. At midday and evening, similar fare. When supplies permit, there is fish or canned meat, perhaps vegetables. The portions are not generous by American standards, but for men who have gone days with almost nothing, the regularity is itself astonishing. Water is chlorinated, buckets are refilled, latrines are dug and maintained, sometimes by the prisoners themselves. Lice are hunted. In some camps, delousing powder is issued with brusque efficiency. Medical care, though limited by wartime strains, becomes a central feature of this new existence. American doctors and corpsmen make rounds, accompanied by interpreters where available. They examine infected wounds left from battle, perform amputations when gangrene threatens, distribute quinine or atabrine for malaria, sulfa drugs for infected cuts, dress ulcers caused by malnutrition. Teeth are pulled, bandages are changed. Some of the prisoners have never seen such concentration of medical effort, even in their own army. The contrast with the neglected, starving Allied POWs in Japanese camps, about whom these men often know little or nothing, is bitterly ironic. Beyond Okinawa, the flow continues. From the Ryukyus, the Philippines, and other recaptured territories, Japanese POWs are gradually shipped to larger camps on Guam, in Hawaii, and in the continental United States. On Guam, sprawling compounds rise on former battlefields. In Hawaii, fenced sections of Oahu house men who had once believed they would die on foreign soil. In the American heartland, places like Texas, Colorado, and Idaho, smaller groups help with agricultural labor under guard, surrounded by an alien landscape of cornfields and small towns. Wherever they are sent, the pattern repeats. Regular meals, roll calls, medical inspections, work details, building roads, unloading cargo, or tending crops. Some camps provide basic education classes or orientation sessions designed to expose prisoners to American life and democratic ideas. Others remain purely functional, focusing on order and subsistence. Time stretches. For many Japanese POWs, daily life becomes a series of small routines. Lining up at the mess, washing clothes, talking quietly with fellow prisoners about families, about the war's progress, about what will happen to Japan. News filters in sometimes through official announcements, sometimes through rumor of air raids on Tokyo, of battles in the Philippines, of the loss of Germany. At night, the men lie on bunks or mats, staring at ceilings or out through the dim outlines of wire against the sky, and think about the last days before their capture. The decision not to die, the surprise of not being killed. Later testimonies collected by Japanese scholars and by veterans groups would describe a recurring moment of realization among these men. It did not always come immediately. Sometimes it arrived only after weeks or months of steady meals and competent medical attention. It was the understanding that the Americans, whatever hatred burned at the front, had placed their prisoners inside a system that assumed they would live. For men raised on the belief that surrender erased honor and invited deliberate cruelty, that realization landed with a force almost equal to the shells that had driven them from their caves. It compelled them to revisit everything they had been taught about their enemy, and more painfully about the leadership that had told them no other path existed. The battlefields of Saipan and Okinawa had scarred their bodies and minds. The barbed wire enclosures that followed began to reshape their understanding of the war itself. From that reshaping would flow consequences far beyond the edges of the camps, into statistics of survival, into courtroom trials, and into the difficult narratives Japan and the Allied nations would build about what had been done and what had been endured. By the summer of 1945, the contrast between those who had fallen into Japanese hands and those now held by the Americans could be measured not just in memories, but in numbers. Roughly 140,000 Western Allied servicemen, British, Australian, Dutch, American, and others, had been captured by Japan during the war. Around a quarter of them, more than 35,000, did not survive. On the Burma-Thailand Railway, in camps like Changi, at copper mines and airfields across Southeast Asia, they died from starvation, untreated disease, beatings, overwork, and execution. In some groups, the mortality rate climbed above 30%. Among Asian laborers and conscripted workers, the toll was even higher, harder to count, but vast. On the other side of the ledger, Japanese soldiers captured by the United States, Britain, and Australia experienced a very different fate. By VJ Day, the Western Allies held hundreds of thousands of Japanese prisoners. Exact totals vary with definitions and timing, but in the Pacific and Southeast Asia theaters combined, more than 500,000 Japanese military personnel would eventually be processed by British, American, Australian, and Dutch authorities. If Soviet-captured troops in Manchuria and Siberia are included, the total Japanese POW population climbs well over 1 million. Within the spheres controlled by the United States and its Western partners, death rates for Japanese POWs generally stayed in the low single digits, a few percent, often less, and most of those deaths stemmed from wounds and illnesses suffered before capture. On Okinawa, perhaps 7,000 Japanese soldiers survived as prisoners. In the Philippines, where the tide turned in 1944-45, tens of thousands more surrendered in scattered groups to American and Filipino forces. On Guam, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, and scores of smaller islands, every cave cleared in the final months of the war seemed to add another handful of gaunt men to the prisoner rolls. These men entered a network of camps that shifted purpose almost overnight when Japan announced its surrender in August 1945. On 15 August, Japanese radio carried the Emperor's voice for the first time, accepting the Potsdam Declaration. On Okinawa, Guam, Luzon, in Hawaii, and on the American mainland, barbed wire enclosures filled with Japanese prisoners became, in effect, holding centers for a defeated army awaiting its return home. The routines did not stop. Roll calls continued, rations still arrived, doctors and medics still made rounds, camp commandants received new orders not to tighten conditions but to prepare for repatriation, names had to be confirmed, identities checked, transport schedules drawn up for ships now headed the other way across the Pacific. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which had struggled throughout the war to gain meaningful access to Allied prisoners in Japanese hands, now found it easier to inspect camps run by the victors. Delegates visited American-run facilities, noted food quantities, medical provisions, living quarters. Their reports, sent back to Geneva and distributed to governments, reinforced the picture that had emerged slowly over the previous years. Whatever happened in the heat of battle, the official Allied prison camp system roughly met the standards set by Geneva. For many Japanese POWs, the surrender of their country came not as a triumphant homecoming, but as a scratchy announcement over a loudspeaker in a foreign tongue, followed by a translated summary. Some wept, others stared blankly, numb after years of indoctrination that promised either victory or a glorious death. A few refused to believe it, insisting that the broadcast was an American trick. Over the following weeks, as more detailed news arrived, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the formal signing of surrender aboard the battleship Missouri on 2 September, denial became harder to sustain. In the camps, material life in some ways improved. With the end of active fighting, strain on supply lines eased. In certain locations, rations became slightly more varied. Access to news, even if filtered and controlled, expanded. In some American camps on the mainland, educational and reorientation programs were introduced, lectures, films, carefully chosen reading materials designed to present a different picture of the United States and its political system than wartime propaganda had allowed. Then, in late 1945 and through 1946, the long journeys home began. Ships that had once carried invasion troops and equipment now loaded lines of prisoners, some still in remnants of their uniforms, others in camp-issued clothing. On docks from Seattle to Manila, guards checked names against lists, handed each man a small pack or kit and marched them up gangways. Medical checks were done one more time, the holds and decks filled with quiet, watchful faces. When these ships reached Japanese ports, Kure, Sasebo, Yokohama, the men who disembarked stepped into a country transformed. Cities lay in ruins. Bombing and blockade had shattered industry and transport. Food shortages were acute. In the winter of 1946, many civilians in Tokyo, Osaka, and other urban centers survived on thin gruel, black market scraps, or relief supplies brought by occupation forces. Children's bellies swelled from malnutrition. Tuberculosis and other diseases spread in cramped, unheated shelters. Japanese POWs returning from American custody often found, to their astonishment and guilt, that they were in better physical condition than relatives who had endured the final year of war at home. Years of regular camp rations, however meager they had seemed inside the wire, had left many prisoners less emaciated than the brothers or neighbors who greeted them. Those who came back from camps in the United States or Australia sometimes brought stories of medical care, of filling meals on Midwestern farms or in island compounds, that sounded to their listeners like tales from another world. The dissonance cut deep. Men who had been taught that surrender meant certain torture had instead been fed and treated by the enemy, and now saw how little their own government had been able to offer its people. That realization blended with knowledge, trickling out through news of trials and testimonies, that Allied POWs in Japanese hands had suffered and died in appalling numbers. The experiences of captivity, once regarded as an unmentionable shame, became threads in a larger, painful tapestry that post-war Japan and the Allied countries would argue over, examine, and sometimes try to look away from. In courtrooms from Tokyo to Manila, another reckoning was taking shape. Even before the war formally ended, the Allies had agreed that Japanese leaders and officers would be tried for crimes committed against civilians and prisoners of war. In 1946, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in Tokyo. 11 judges from Allied nations listened as prosecutors detailed campaigns of aggression, massacres in China, and the grinding destruction of captured soldiers on Fusad-Lubk projects. Parallel to the Tokyo trial, dozens of smaller war crimes tribunals opened across Asia and the Pacific, in Singapore, Hong Kong, Manila, Yokohama, and elsewhere. Many focused specifically on the treatment of Allied POWs. Survivors from the Burma, Thailand railway testified about beatings, deliberate starvation, and speedo work drives that killed men by the thousands. Former prisoners from Bataan described the death march, men shot or bayoneted when they fell, dunned water under a blazing sun. In some cases, Japanese officers who had overseen camps or transport columns were confronted by their 1M captives across the courtroom. Evidence presented in these trials made grim reading. Medical records and camp rolls, where they existed, showed death spirals that contrasted starkly with figures from American run camps. Japanese defense lawyers sometimes argued that shortages of food and medicine in the shrinking empire left little for prisoners. Prosecutors countered with proof that POWs had often been given significantly less than Japanese guards, or had been forced into lethal labor while supplies were diverted elsewhere. In this environment, the United States and its allies pointed not only to Japanese atrocities, but also to their own adherence, however imperfect, to Geneva standards. American officials highlighted Red Cross inspection reports from POW camps in the United States, the Pacific, and Europe. They emphasized the relative survival rates of Japanese prisoners in Western custody. Documents detailing ration scales, camp regulations, and medical provisions were entered into evidence. The image of Japanese POWs receiving daily food and medicine was not only a matter of individual memory. It became part of the prosecutorial narrative that drew a moral boundary between the two systems. For many Japanese citizens, the full extent of their own army's brutality came as a shock. Censorship during the war had kept most atrocity reports hidden. Now, press stories and radio broadcasts about the Tokyo trial and others began to reveal details. Accounts from repatriated Allied POWs published in Allied newspapers and occasionally reprinted or summarized in Japan added to the picture. Some returning Japanese POWs brought back fragmentary knowledge as well, rumors heard from guards, glimpses of emaciated Allied prisoners in transit, or encounters in mixed holding facilities late in the war. At the same time, their own stories of relatively regular meals and medical treatment in American hands were complicated by shame. Many ex-prisoners stayed silent. Others minimized their captivity, describing it simply as detention or work duty. In the early post-war decades, Japanese public attention focused more on the bombing of cities, the atomic attacks, and the suffering of civilians than on what had been done in distant camps under the rising sun flag. School textbooks reflected this emphasis. In the 1950s and 1960s, Japanese histories of the war tended to mention the existence of war crimes trials and mistakes by the military, but they often did so briefly without dwelling on the specifics of POW abuse. The experiences of Japanese prisoners in American camps surfaced rarely, usually in memoirs or local recollections rather than in national narratives. In the Allied nations, memory took a different shape. In Britain, Australia, the Netherlands, and among American units that had fought in the Philippines and Pacific, the suffering of POWs under Japanese control became a central symbol of Japanese cruelty. The F-Force and D-Force on the Burma Railway, the Sendikun death marches, Bataan, these names entered public consciousness as shorthand for endurance and betrayal. Veterans associations kept the stories alive. Films and books etched images of skeletal men in jungle camps into popular culture. Within this context, the knowledge that Japanese POWs in Western hands had generally fared better sometimes sharpened resentment. Former Allied prisoners, remembering their own starvation, could feel bitter hearing that their captors had been well-fed in American camps. For some, the moral contrast was a source of grim pride. For others, it raised questions about justice, forgiveness, and whether anything could truly balance the scales. Inside Japan, a slow, uneven reassessment unfolded over decades. As censorship eased and historians dug into archives, more detailed accounts of Japanese conduct in Asia emerged. Activists and scholars pressed for fuller acknowledgement of atrocities against both prisoners of war and civilians. Former Japanese POWs began, in some cases, to speak more openly about their decision to surrender, about life in American camps, about the disbelief they had felt when handed food and medicine by men they had been told were monsters. Their testimonies added nuance to a picture often painted only in black and white. They described guards who were indifferent, sometimes kind, occasionally cruel. They spoke of boredom and homesickness, of humiliation and relief. They remembered the first bowl of rice after days of hiding in a cave, the sting of disinfectant on a long infected wound, the strange experience of watching newsreels about Japan's defeat projected on a sheet inside a camp thousands of miles from home. Between these personal recollections and the broader national narratives of victimhood, of guilt, of victory and loss, there remained gaps and tensions. For some Japanese, admitting that American treatment of POWs had often been humane undermined a wartime story that made sense of defeat as pure tragedy. For some in Allied countries, acknowledging that ordinary Japanese soldiers had been trapped by their own system, and sometimes treated humanely by the enemy only after terrible battles, complicated an image of the war as a struggle of good against absolute evil. Yet within those complexities lies the real human story. It is there, in the ordinary details of camp meals and clinic visits, that the core question emerges, quieter but sharper than any courtroom argument. What does it mean when the enemy's hand, which in battle held a rifle, in captivity holds out water and medicine instead? In the end, the story of these prisoners traces a narrow line between what men were taught to believe and what they actually saw. For Japanese soldiers raised under the Senjinkan and the shadow of bushido, surrender was supposed to be a kind of living death, a stain on the self that could never be washed away. Their superiors counted on that belief. It was a weapon as much as any rifle, binding men to positions that could no longer be held, persuading them that there was no path but forward into enemy fire or over a cliff's edge. On the American side, a different set of words held sway. Articles in a convention signed in Geneva, paragraphs in field manuals, memoranda from distant headquarters. These too were a kind of story. They promised that a man who laid down his arms would be recorded, fed, given at least the minimum of care. They did not erase rage or prejudice at the front, but they created a framework in which a captured enemy was, by default, someone to be managed and preserved rather than eliminated. Where these two narratives met, in caves on Saipan, on slopes above Okinawa's camps, behind new strung wire on Guam and Oahu, the collision was deeply personal. For many Japanese POWs, the shock was not simply that they lived, but how they lived. The regular bowl of rice, the bandage changed by an enemy medic, the vaccination needle in an arm already scarred by war. These small routines undermined years of propaganda more effectively than any leaflet. They suggested that the enemy was capable of restraint, that he recognized obligations even toward those who had tried to kill him. That realization did not excuse the brutalities committed elsewhere, nor did it erase the suffering of Allied prisoners in Japanese hands. But it revealed something essential about industrial war in the 20th century, that even in its darkest campaigns there were structures, legal, logistical, moral, that could bend men toward survival instead of annihilation. In many post-war accounts, former Japanese POWs lingered on a simple image, sitting on the ground, still dazed from capture, as an American guard handed them a metal mess tin filled with hot food. In that gesture, they understood lay a truth their commanders had never told them. The war they thought they were fighting and the enemy they thought they faced had never quite matched the reality.